welcome to Just One Thing for Parents. I'm Bettina Hohnen. Today, I'm bringing you a special must-have moments episode as it's ADHD Awareness Month here in the UK. I pulled together highlights from 4 really fantastic episodes that are real essential listening for parents supporting young people with ADHD or with executive function difficulties. So the episodes that I've picked are going to take you on a developmental journey to support these neurodiverse children. Actually, they're helpful for all kids, but particularly for kids who struggle in this way. We'll start with Laurie Faith, who gives us a brilliant understanding of what executive functions are and their role in everyday life. She also shares some amazing advice for parents of young children on how to really build a strong foundation of executive function skills right from the start. And it's all about fun and joy and connection. Next, we get Peg Dawson, who is going to focus on building executive functions in the teenage years. So she shares some really great anecdotes and some really fascinating science, thinking about supporting teens at a time when their brains are changing really rapidly. And quite honestly, they're not always so keen to get our advice. So how do we go about that? Then we will hear from Linda Phillips, who takes us up to the next stage, discussing how to support neurodiverse students as they transition to university. And obviously, our role is changing, our role is evolving at this time. And Linda helps us think about how we can step back when it's hard to let them kind of navigate this journey and their own challenges and support them on that journey. And then finally, we're going to hear from Jo Steer. And she did an episode talking about what we can do while we're waiting for an ADHD diagnosis for our child, because certainly in the UK at the moment, the waiting lists are very long. So it's a really needs-led approach that she talks about, talking about things that you can do to support young people even before you have a formal diagnosis. So there's lots of practical tips and ideas, and I've picked out all the best bits. So please enjoy and keep listening to must-have moments about ADHD and executive functions.
Simpler way to think about what executive functions are. These are the skills that we use when we're moving out of habit and out of rote activities, when we actually have to sit up straight, wake up, and apply some problem solving to a fresh scenario that's newly challenging, that's unusual or unexpected.
Wow. So they're everyday skills that we use all the time. They're actually housed in the frontal part of the brain, aren't they? They have a very specific location in the brain and very slow to develop over childhood, aren't they?
They're slow to develop. The way that EFs develop in childhood are very similar, I think, to how the brain slowly took shape over time as we evolved into human beings. If you go into a museum of human history and see a set of skulls showing how the human skull slowly evolved into what it is now, one of the most noticeable things you'll see is the forehead starting to bulge from being what was a very flat forehead. And this really provides evidence of just how this whole structure was the most recent piece of the brain to grow, to come online, to be of service to humans. And, it's not a small structure, but we can think of it almost like a baby. It's a bit of a vulnerable structure. The rest of the brain typically sort of remains on and functioning, but during times of distress, where humans are trying to conserve resources, conserve energy, and take quick action, this is actually a part of the brain that sort of shuts down first. Right. Sort of a vulnerable part of the brain that's like the baby part of the brain, the most recent acquisition.
Right. And also, I've heard it described as like the conductor in the orchestra. It's the bit that tells the rest of the brain what to do. It's so interesting, isn't it? That comparison between it being the baby of the brain, but also the bit that's in charge.
Yeah, it's sort of unfortunate that it has such an important responsibility, it being so vulnerable and sort of temperamental.
Yes.
And what I work with lots of teachers and parents as well. And really the big message is the more calm and safe and connected and happy your child is, the more this part of the brain is accessible and is energized and is able to function and able to grow. And conversely, the more stressed and overwhelmed, maybe feeling lonely, maybe feeling anxious, especially performance anxiety, this really shuts down these executive functions. Researchers doing clinical tests will see a big dip in results in executive function performance just from an unfamiliar person standing behind a child who's doing these tests at a computer.
Wow.
The impact of stress is quite profound on executive functions.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to get to the question. The question is, what is just one thing that parents of young children can do to move their kids to being more organized, more attentive, and better at managing the demands of everyday life, otherwise known as the executive function skills? So if you could just pick out one thing that you think is like really important for parents to know and how they can support their kids in developing these really important life skills.
I love this question, Bettina, because I have a 19-year-old upstairs and I'm sitting in my 16-year-old's room. And I know you have children who are entering adulthood too. And it's like, this is what I think about all the time. And it's often, if I could go back and do one thing differently, what would it be?
Yes.
The age of like, oh, if only I had done that. And so just one thing for me is to know that time between birth and about age 5 or 6, before, wherever you're listening to this, wherever your children enter formal schooling and begin to take a lot of influence from other people and receive a lot of structure and support from other people. But up until that time, where parents are really the main event, where we're really sort of the star of their show, where we are the main influence, I just think it's so important for people to know that this is like game time and that there is so much that can be done. It's a bit of a sprint. I know all of parenthood is a bit of a sprint. You always feel shorthanded and like there's a ball dropping on the floor here and there as you're juggling. But if I could go back those years from birth to age 4 or 5, I would do everything I could to be as present and attentive and engaged. Like I would pile all of my resources onto that project because it's a very sensitive time for EF development. Really, at that age, this is when this part of the brain is doing it's in its most rapid period of development. It's the most plastic. It's the most adaptable. And so, there are things that you need to keep in mind during that time. Number one is just, I think, like this phone is sort of your number one enemy at this time. Right. It's almost like smoking a cigarette. People have said this before, but it really is like smoking a cigarette with your baby. Wow,
what a way of putting that. Goodness me.
I think it's it's as harmful.
Gosh.
And because really at this age, what builds the brain is, first of all, loads of attentive and interactive engagement, really listening to children's cues, even babies' cues, and responding and adjusting and attending to the smallest nuance, noticing emotions that they're feeling and reflecting them back and understanding why they're feeling those emotions, doing all those things to stimulate and engage, singing songs together, doing clapping and rhyming and playing with their limbs and their bodies and moving them around as much as you can, accessing community supports, free programs at libraries, some of those programs where a musician will come in and there's some drumming and there's some tapping and music, and maybe some animals are coming in or painting or whatever it is. I think sometimes something that parents are aware of is that that they are prone to competition. I think sometimes we steer away from going all out in this way because we think you need to calm down. This isn't a competition. I'm not trying to be better than the parent next door. It doesn't make a difference if my kid is home or if they're in a music session. I'm not steering towards bragging rights here. I just want a healthy, happy kid. And I think it's good for people to know that it really actually does make a big difference. The more that you can do, the more, especially as children begin to become literate, start learning words and communicating and expressing, the more different places they can go, the more different things they can be exposed to, the more experiences they can have. It all adds up to more semantic knowledge. So more knowledge of how the world works, more knowledge of the words that you need to talk about that, but also just more confidence in general.
And there's this wonderful quote actually from Adele Diamond, who, is one of the leaders in this film. One of the leaders in this field, who I know you know very well. And she says in one of her papers, improving executive functions is a serious business, but there is no reason it needs to be joyless.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that is something I like. When I think about that, I think about Adele Diamond, but I also think of you, Bettina, in your emphasis on connection and relationship. And this is something, it's true, that comes from the therapy world and just from the empirical world, how important actually warm, nurturing, joyful relationships are. I mean, it goes back to this idea, for me, how I think about it is this idea that the prefrontal cortex is vulnerable to stress, and that it's the very safe, secure, nurtured, happy child who has the ability to access everything that is possible in the prefrontal cortex, where it really kind of turns on. I mean, I've talked to neuroscientists who look at these neurons with really fine microscopes, and they can see traumatized children under a lot of stress. There are these potassium channels. They're like these physical channels that allow messages to be sent through neurons that actually just are closed during
really
times of stress. Yeah, it just really isn't working. It just really isn't functional and on. And sometimes I say to educators, there may be a child in your classroom who you've actually never seen in the fullness of their cognitive potential. Mm-hmm. They may always be showing you that sort of blurry, overwhelmed, confused, disorganized, maybe compensating, trying to seek some competence and some status amongst their peers by doing mischief, because they are just really unable to think clearly and perform as they would want to at school. And you can imagine these are the same kids that go home. Maybe they're around a grandparent, or they're playing with their siblings or very close, safe friends. And these are children who feel completely different in different settings. And I think everybody's felt that way. Like you come out of a meeting where it's like a stressful meeting, and you think, oh my goodness, I couldn't find my words and I wasn't articulating myself properly. And then you think, gosh, if I could say it all now from my car on the drive home when I'm listening to my favorite song and it's sunny and I have a cup of tea. Our brain really works differently in different contexts.
Wow. So what you're saying is that the research evidence, even at the neuron level, shows that stress has a really negative impact on the functioning of the prefrontal cortex. And what's inherent in what you're saying, which I think is so helpful for parents to know, is that it's not that kids or even people have the skills or don't have the skills. In different contexts, the brain is able to access those skills. And one of the key things around whether they're able to access it is to do with this joy and connection and the relationship of the person they're with.
I just want to, from me to you, parents who are just starting out, it's a hard time actually in a home, in a family, when your kids are young. Maybe you've been with your partner, if you have a partner, for a while. I mean, I guess this is really more for people who are parenting with someone. But it can be a hard time in terms of your relationship with one another. And, it's kids really sometimes happen around the 5 to 7 year mark, which is when things start to get tricky. And if I could go back and do it again, I would just try as hard as I could to really stay focused on this project of parenting for young children, and sort of like really actively stop myself from being distracted by difficulties that are going on. The marriage difficulties can be really distracting during this time, and I think they need to be attended to.
Yeah.
You know, of course, put your own gas mask on before you help your children, but just to realize, I think that that's quite a threat to the amount of energy and time and focus that you're able to give children when it's like you really need to pile it on. It's really game time. You have to do everything you can.
Yeah.
Just to do two things at once sometimes, but remember that focusing on children is going to pay massive, massive dividends.
What would be your top tip for parents?
Okay, so this is something, when I first started talking about it, I thought I was being kind of whimsical. And I thought, well, I don't know whether this works or not, but I'll throw it out there and see what happens. And almost immediately, people started telling me stories that fit my perfect intervention. So here it is.
Okay.
The perfect intervention to support executive skill development is one that takes no more than 5 or 10 minutes a day, and that you're willing to do forever, or as long as it takes. And those two go hand in hand, because if it took more than 5 or 10 minutes a day, you couldn't keep it up long enough for it to be effective.
Right.
And I can almost guarantee you that if you keep it up long enough, it won't take forever. But I can also almost guarantee you that it will take longer than you think it should.
Okay.
Because what we're talking about here around executive skills in teens is we're talking about habit formation. It takes a long time to really develop a habit. And so as I say, when I first started talking about this, can you really do something in just 5 minutes a day and keep it up long enough for it to work? But let me just give you a few examples, and then we can open it up for questions or comments.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I mentioned this, I had a mom in my workshop, 7th grader on the spectrum. So he has autism spectrum disorder. She said starting when he was in 1st grade, she had put together a getting ready for school routine. And she walked him through that routine every day, everything he had to do to get ready for school. She said he's now in 7th grade. And this year, for the first time, he goes through that routine completely independently without any cues, supports, or reminders from her.
Wow.
So that took 6 years.
6 years.
I'm thinking, any kid on the spectrum who's getting ready for school by himself without need for supports, that's one for the win column.
Yeah.
So that's one example. Let me give you another one. I had a mom of a 4th grader who said that, again, starting when he was in 4th grade, when he sat down for breakfast every day, she would say to him, have you checked your planner? Because what she wanted him to do was check his planner, because that told him what the day was going to be like. It told him what he needed to remember to bring to school. It might tell him what his after-school activities were, so he knew what the schedule was. And every day he would sit down at the breakfast table, and she said, have you checked your planner? And he would go, no, I haven't. And he'd open the planner. But she said, he's now in 4th grade. And now, as soon as he sits down for breakfast every day, he opens the planner.
Wow.
So again, 3 years, but they got there. Yeah. And so after I talked about this for about a year or two, it finally occurred to me, wait, I used this same process with my own son. I didn't realize it was a 5-minute rule, but that's what it was. So I have 2 sons. They're both in their 40s now, but my older son at the age of 14 was diagnosed with an attention disorder. And so, he was diagnosed, as I say, in the 8th grade. And I went through this thought process of, first of all, realizing, okay, I got 4 years. That's all I got until he graduates from high school. And basically I said to myself, what do I want him to look like by the time he's a senior? And so it helped me prioritize. The clean bedroom went out the window at that point. I thought, we'll deal with a quasi-messy bedroom. That's not a big deal. But what I decided was there were 2 things I wanted to focus on. I wanted to make sure to the best I could, without being overly intrusive, that he did his homework and that he handed it in on time.
Right.
And so every day when he came home from school, I asked him 2 questions. What do you have to do? When are you going to do it?
Right.
And it was only later that I realized, that took no more than 5 minutes. And I would say, his senior year, so we started this when he was in 7th or 8th grade. It may have been before he was diagnosed. by his senior year, when I looked back on it, I realized, oh, it had started to fade naturally. You know, it wasn't an everyday conversation anymore. Sometimes he would spontaneously tell me what his plan was, and other times he would just do it without any conversation. So again, that took 4 or 5 years, but to this day, and he's in his mid-40s, he will tell me, that's how I start my day. What do I have to do? When am I going to do it?
Wow.
So those are just a few examples that make me feel like, yeah, this is actually a workable intervention.
Yeah.
And
so the intervention it's 5 minutes, and the 5 minutes, can you just say exactly what that is? You know, what is the intervention?
So again, I mean, that's probably the frustrating part of it and the versatility of it. It's not a perfect intervention. It's a rule for a perfect intervention.
Okay.
So whatever you want to do, and again, using my own son, prioritizing, what do we want to focus on? And if I were going to be doing it now, I would start with not me as the parent deciding what we're going to focus on, but a conversation between me and my teenage kid.
Yes.
So what do you want to work on? What are you frustrated by? What do you think you'd like to get a little better at? What can I help you with? And obviously, by the time kids hit adolescence, they don't necessarily want their parents helping them. Yeah. And in fact, I remember doing a parent workshop where I told the story about my son and what do you have to do when you're going to do it. And I got this email from mom afterwards, and she said, okay, so my son's in high school, he's in 10th grade. She said, so yesterday I said, so what do you have to do? When are you going to do it? And he said, Mom, it's none of your business. And that's where I realized, I started doing this when my kid was like 13 or 14. Yeah. So he hadn't hit that teenage resistance piece, and then it became a habit. So
right.
It might be that's why I think the adaptation would really be, can it be a conversation between you and the kid?
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily something that you're going to help him with, although you may want to talk to him about, okay, so that's a great idea. That won't take more than 5 minutes. How are you going to remember it to do it? Would you like a cue? Do you want to put an alarm in your smartphone? Is there something I can do to help, or do you want me to stay out of it?
Yeah.
And then probably, so when should we check back to see how it's going? Again, if the kid is going to take more and more control over this, then you do want to check in just to reflect, how's it going? What have we learned? What can we do differently? If you set a goal of doing something like every day for 5 minutes, give yourself 2 days off.
Okay.
And there's a really interesting research study where they did that. They set up a really boring task for people to do, divided them into 3 groups. And one group, they said, okay, your goal is to do this for 7 days. Another group, they said, no, your goal is to do this for 5 days. And a third group, they said, your goal is to do this for 7 days, but you get 2 free passes. And what they found was, of those 3 groups, the ones that did the most were the ones who had the 7-day goal with 2 free passes.
Right.
So that was even more than the group that it was just 5 days. So that 2 free passes, because then you can decide when are you going to use that pass.
Yeah.
And so that's the other piece I would build into this as well. Yeah. Now, the good news is, we know from neuroplasticity, is that it's easier for the brain to change during the teenage years than it is when people are older.
Yes.
And so I have a chart. It was developed by the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard that shows how hard it is to acquire a habit. And what it shows is, and it goes from like birth to age 70. And what it shows that during the teen years is really sort of the sweet spot that and the way they measure how hard the brain has to work is glucose consumption. Right. So they basically look at how much glucose are you burning as you're trying to change your behavior. And what they find is that, up until the late teens, you're burning very little glucose. And then after that, it goes sharply up. I often use that graph to say that's why it's so much harder to learn a second language at age 50 than it is to learn a second language at age 5. Yeah. But during the teenage year, and I say to teenagers, you may think it's really hard to memorize those Spanish vocabulary words or learn that musical instrument or those football plays or whatever. It will never be easier than it is right now. So take advantage of it if you can. So,
when using the term neurodivergence, in this case, I'm referring to students who are autistic or have ADHD. The term neurodivergence obviously refers to a much wider group of people, including things like dyslexia, dyspraxia, etc. So it's really referring to a different way of processing information. And of course, all of this falls into the category of hidden disability, which makes it really complicated at this time, because it's really hard to see what the student is struggling with, particularly when they're shifting from one environment, i.e. the home environment, to the university environment. The demands are changing. And so, it's not always very easy to detect what the barriers are going to be. And I think it marks a hugely vulnerable time in life for these students, and the need to change the way that we support so that they feel supported but not smothered in this new phase of life where they are gaining independence, but maybe still struggling with some very significant and basic things compared to their same age peers. So, just thinking about the kinds of things that they might be struggling with, I think there are three key areas that tend to show up. And the first one is their self-management skills. So this is looking at all the things that would be affected by having potentially weaker executive function skills. So suddenly they're having to, shop for their food, cook, prepare food, eat, remember to eat, remember to take their medication if they've got medication, remember their appointments, find their way around campus, keep track of their personal belongings, read their emails, manage their finances, their schedules, their deadlines. And these are things that either they had lots of prompts around at home, so the parent may have been prompting, or the school structure was holding all of this in place for them. And suddenly that all shifts at university, and the whole learning style is different. They've got this it's much more self-directed kinds of learning. And this doesn't necessarily work well for students who like structure, who like guidance, who like specifics. They may be told to go away and just research a topic, but they don't know where to start. They don't know how to structure it. They don't know what the expectations are. So they can get really stuck with the self-management skills. They can get really stuck with academic challenges, which again, people might not expect that, because you've had a student who's academically very able, who succeeds all the way through school. And then suddenly, because of these changing expectations, they're finding it very difficult. The whole relationship dynamic changes, because at school, maybe they had friends that they made early on when the parents were arranging get-togethers and so on, or just the familiarity of seeing people every day, or having to go to sports clubs and music clubs and so on. They've got connections, and suddenly again, for the first time, they're surrounded by strangers and not necessarily equipped to know how to make friends, how to keep friends. And also, if you think about the way friendships form at university, it's party time. Freshers Week, it's loud, it's sensory overload, it's very, very different. Again, it lacks a level of structure and kind of slow build up that they will have had in the past. So again, it can feel extremely overwhelming on the relationship front as well as the self-management front. So I think that what that means is that you've got people who are struggling oftentimes with a lot of stress, and that these people who are struggling with stress are not necessarily equipped either to recognize those stress signals, or know how to regulate those difficult emotions, or know what to do with them. So I think we recognize that this is all happening simultaneously. So this massive jump happens, and the impact on the student can be really significant. But it's happening at a time when the parent is not there. So the question is, what does the child do?
Yeah. And the child is driven for independence and autonomy.
Yes.
Like
exactly.
they're really excited to be on their own, to be,
Yes.
they feel really grown up, and their brain is telling them,
Yes.
do it, but your way, it's
Yes.
your time now.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
What is a parent to do?
What is the parent to do? And I think that is, the life of the student is changing. The life of a parent is not changing. We have stayed static in the sense that our environment hasn't adjusted, but theirs has very significantly. So I think as parents, one of the dangers, and I know that this was true for me certainly, is that we continue to want to parent in the same way that we did when they were younger, and they don't want to be parented like that anymore because, as you say, they're embracing this new world of independence, and even if they're struggling, it's still really hard to be treated like a younger child. They want to be given that independence. And I think there are a lot of things that we as parents can do, but none of it will work if we don't have a good relationship with them and if we don't have good communication with them. And so I think one of the key things as a parent is initially, especially if you do have a neurodivergent youngster, is to build in regular check-ins. So they know it's coming, you know it's coming, and it can be quite frequent in the beginning. You can space it out a bit more as you go along. But I think it's really important because when students are struggling, it's not one thing that trips them up. It's a slow unraveling that takes place. And it's really hard to see that happening unless you have good communication, unless the communication is non-pressured, and you can begin to pick up, and detect from their tone of voice or little things that they say and address things gently and gradually. And I think the big shift in our communication is to steer away from direct advice, from telling them what to do. This has been such a lesson for me as a parent, is just to learn to listen and to say, wow, that sounds really hard.
Yeah.
What do you think might help here? And just give them the space to problem solve, because they are not necessarily talking to friends or others their own age. And that's where a lot of students will be working out how to solve problems. They're talking about it. These students may not have that space to do that. Their different way of processing information may mean that they are more problem orientated and don't necessarily quickly revert into problem solving mode. So I think, just giving them the space to process and to think, what would I do? And they might surprise you.
Yeah.
When I know in working with students, quite often I'll ask, and I'm sometimes surprised at the responses that come back, and they may be different from what we would tell them to do. But it's a solution that they have an inherent wisdom to go and find the thing that works for them. The other thing is, from a parenting perspective, is yes, we may not understand the content of their work because they've chosen a subject we know nothing about. It doesn't matter, because a lot of these things are really quite common sense.
Yeah.
As parents, I think we do have the tools to help them to navigate, but it is, how do we present that to them? What does our communication look like with them? And really changing from being very directive to very facilitating. And it sounds so simple.
Yeah.
Actually really hard to do. It's, to bite your tongue and ask a question rather than tell them what the next step is. And just to go, wow, tell me more.
Yeah.
Or, what do you think might help?
Yeah.
It's
So
not the easiest thing to do.
It's not easy. It's not easy.
My main top tip is to just think, about supporting the child's needs and really take that needs-based approach. So getting to know and understand the individual profile of that child and what their strengths and challenges are, and trying to think about what the support looks like to help them with their needs. And you may well be using many of the strategies that we know are effective and evidence-based for ADHD, but without that diagnosis being formalized. But in a way, by you've already got a good idea that this is possible and likely if you're on a waiting list, and therefore thinking, right, what support can I access in the meantime?
When thinking about needs, I suppose how a parent might work out what the need is to say, well, what was the problem? Like, would it be that? Like, what actually brought us to this point of thinking? Where
are the key struggles and worries? What do I feel like my child is finding harder than I would have expected, or that perhaps I've seen other children of the same age, manage? And typically for ADHD, that might be things like, well, they seem like they are quite impulsive. They, really making these decisions without thinking them through. They're not very good at waiting. They're really impatient. Or it could be more of that hyperactivity, that constant need for movement, fidgeting up and down, really busyness physically and mentally. So we talk about a busy brain quite a bit. Or in the inattention realm, it could be those, really struggling to organize themselves, to focus for, the expected period of time for a child of their age and ability, being able to remember their things, not lose things all the time. Those kind of key parts, they are very likely to be some of the needs that a child who is waiting for an ADHD assessment has. And actually, there's one last one, which is a big one that we don't talk about as much because it's not in the criteria, but thinking about managing emotions, so emotional regulation. So, those big feelings and becoming really dysregulated and really struggling. So whether that's expressed through angry behavior and shouting or upset and distress and tears, or actually just real retreat and kind of not withdrawing from people around them. But that emotional regulation is a really important part of the picture. I think one of the big things that I wanted to highlight is about opening up and having conversations with school. Children spend, a large part of their time every day in a school setting, and typically ADHD really can have quite a big impact on school life, on learning, on friendships. And so even whilst waiting for that assessment, it's really important to get that conversation up and running with school. And schools are very good at being needs-led. That's, a big part of what they do. And so making sure that there is a conversation about what your child's needs and challenges might be in the classroom or in the playground, and then really thinking with school, well, what support could happen. And we tend to call this support in schools reasonable adjustments. That's the kind of first line that's often used. And there's a really great document on the internet that you can look up. It's called 101 Reasonable Adjustments for ADHD.
I'll put a link to that in the notes.
Yeah, that would be great, because it's loads of brilliant ideas that lots of which don't cost schools a lot of money. They're kind of little tweaks that can happen in an everyday classroom that can make a really big difference to children with ADHD. And getting some of that up and running, depending on the particular concerns of the individual child, is absolutely essential. And we wouldn't want anyone to wait for a formal assessment and diagnosis before putting that support in place. It's really important that we get going with that soon, because, as I said, the wait for the assessments can be so long that these are, really important years of children's education and their lives. So we want everyone to be working to support them as soon as possible. And having that conversation with school and thinking about what it looks like is really important. And schools are very good. They often know what they need to do, but sometimes they might need a bit of an extra nudge from a parent. And so don't be afraid to go in and ask and find out what they're doing, because sometimes schools do things without necessarily even naming it. They're actually just, it's kind of part of the way that a classroom runs. So like access to some fidgets, as an example, things for a child to be fidgeting with, or sometimes we have these big elastic bands that wrap around the bottom of chairs so that children can move their feet whilst they're sat at their desk, and much better than rocking on your chair, which we know can be a real issue. And so how much can the school put in place or be doing? If movement's a big issue, is that possible? Or giving a child like an exit pass if they're at secondary school, so that they can get up, go for a walk around the school and then come back, and appreciating and understanding that movement is actually really important to help that child with their learning.
When we're thinking about, if you are waiting for the ADHD assessment, there are many things you can do. And what your top tip really is to think about what are the needs of your child, and what little tweaks and strategies and adaptations can you make, and can the teachers make. And also understanding, I think that's one of the big things about ADHD. It's what can I do to understand this behavior differently? And I love this idea that children are always, children will do well if they can. And if we can hold that in mind, and with your advice of think about what are their needs, where is there a mismatch between what we're expecting of them and what they're able to deliver, we can do a lot.
Yeah, how can we give them a helping hand with those little challenges so that things are go a bit better and are easier? Definitely. I completely agree. I think that's a really good way of kind of summarizing it all together.